All right, guys, let's talk about the Geneva Convention and specifically about human rights during wartime. So this kind of goes with our unit about military law, right? I mean, what can and can't you do based off of what we have signed in agreements with other countries? So let's take a look at this. Again, these are some websites, videos you can also take a look at. I will put these links in the YouTube video if they still work. Sometimes they don't work anymore, but anyways, I'll do that. So Geneva Convention, you want to write this one down. So first proposed in 1859 by Henry Dunant after seeing the Battle of Solferino, in which 40,000 men died in battle, and then another 40,000 died of their wounds. And so he was just like, yeah, he couldn't believe it, right? I mean, it's inconceivable to believe that. I mean, it's understandable that 40,000 men die in battle. Okay, that happens. But having another 40,000 die just of wounds because they weren't getting the appropriate treatment that they should have gotten, he saw as a problem. He was also inspired by nurses Florence Nightingale and Clara Barton in the U.S. These women had written about what they had seen on the battlefield and how these men had been taken care of, and or the lack of being taken care of. And so he really believed that things needed to change. And so what comes out of this is the International Red Cross and the Red Crescent. And so there's a YouTube video for that as well. So what also comes out of that is the Geneva Convention. And so basically you want to write all this down. It's first drafted and ratified in Europe in response to these European wars and right after the American Civil War or towards the end of it in 1864. Now, obviously, we've had more since then, especially after World War II in 1949. And it's been ratified by 191 countries, pretty much everybody. Led to the establishment of the Red Cross in 1877. The modern conventions guarantee human rights to 4 groups: the sick and wounded, shipwrecked sailors, not that you see that very much anymore, but during World War II you did, so that's why they still have it, prisoners of war, and then civilians in territory occupied by an army. And we will go into those in much more detail later. The human dignity of all individuals must be respected at all times. This basically comes out of Geneva Conventions 1 and 2. And again, there were more than one, right? The first one was early on, 1864, but then more were added as time went on. Everything possible must be done without any kind of discrimination to reduce the suffering of people who have been put out of action by sickness, wounds, or captivity. If a member of an armed forces is wounded or sick and therefore in no condition to take an active part in the hostilities, he is no longer part of the fighting force and becomes a vulnerable person in need of protecting and care, which basically means they are a POW, right? They're a prisoner of war, and you still have to give them medical attention. They're no longer part of that fighting force. Belligerents, which basically is like the fighting force, must treat members of enemy forces who are wounded, sick, or shipwrecked as carefully as their own. And the one that you want to write down from this one is medical equipment must not be intentionally destroyed, and medical establishments and vehicles must not be attacked, damaged, or prevented from operating, which means, right, the Red Cross must be allowed to do their job, okay, or medical ships or medical personnel should be allowed to take care of forces that may need medical help. You want to write all of this down, right? Prisoners of war must be allowed to inform next of kin and International Red Cross of their capture. So if they are captured, you as the belligerent or the nation who has brought in these prisoners of war, you have to allow them to write to their families and let them know that they've been captured. Otherwise, people are waiting. They have no idea if they've been captured or not. They must be allowed to correspond regularly with relatives and receive relief parcels. Not that those relief parcels, like care packages, ever reach them, because in many cases they are taken in between. But realistically, they should be able to get relief parcels, even if they're looked through by the belligerents beforehand. They should be allowed to keep their clothes, feeding utensils, personal effects like pictures and stuff like that. That should not be taken away from them. And that's from the Geneva Convention number 3. Also within Geneva Convention 3, they should be supplied with adequate food and clothing. Quarters are not inferior to those captors' troops. So if the belligerents are sleeping in tents, then it's okay to have the POWs sleeping in tents. But if the belligerents or the army in charge has a roof over their heads, the POWs should also have roof over their heads as well. Maybe not quite as nice, but they should have it. They should be given medical care to their state of health demands. They should be paid for any work that they do. Although the pay may be quite low, they should still be getting paid. Repatriated if certain seriously ill or wounded, but they must not resume active military duties. So say this person is they had both their legs cut off, right? If they have both their legs cut off, they should be able to be sent home to their home country. It's not like they're going to be able to fight a war anytime soon. So why would you keep them as a prisoner of war if you know they're not going to be able to fight again? So they should be able to be sent back to their home country in certain military, in certain illnesses or wounds. They should be quickly released and repatriated when hostilities cease. So once there's no more hostilities, then you should be able to let them go. This one you want to write down from also Geneva Convention 3. Prisoners of war must not be compelled to give any information other than name, age, rank, and service number. Basically, they should be able to give you this. Okay, if you are basically captured, then you should give name, age, rank, and service number. But you should not be tortured or forced to give any other information if necessary. No torture, no inhumane treatment. This should be, right? This is basically considered a war crime, and it should never happen where you are doing torture. Now, we'll come back to this in a little bit because a lot of people believe that, well, terrorists, right? We've tortured terrorists in the past to get information from them. But are they a fighting force, right? Are they of a nation? And so it's been argued that a terrorist is an individual. It is a person who not fighting for a flag or for a nation. They're fighting for a cause, and that's much different. And so torture and inhumane treatment of those types of prisoners can be done because they didn't sign this Geneva Convention, right? They are not of a nation, and so thus it does not apply to people like that. So there's some controversy when it comes to that, and there's a YouTube video you can see there. Detained civilians, and this is from Geneva Convention 4. Detained civilians must be at all times humanely treated. Civilians must be entitled to their family rights, religious practices, and customs. They must be protected against acts or threats of violence and insults. They should be enabled to exchange family news of a personal kind and help to secure news of family members dispersed by the conflict. So they should be able to find them. Things you want to write down on this one is this one right here. Detainees may be questioned, but any form of physical or mental coercion is prohibited against civilians. You cannot torture civilians either. Women shall be protected from indecent assault, prostitution, and rape, which, I mean, should be obvious. Unfortunately, women have always gotten the worst of war, right? I mean, like, they're when a village is taken, they're the first to be raped and murdered, right? So yeah, it's unfortunate, and so the Geneva Convention 4 is meant to help them with that. 2 protocols added in 1977, not ratified by every nation, but over 160 nations ratified this. Adds explicit protections to outlaw attacks on civilian targets. It prohibits attacking dams, houses of worship, food, water supplies. It prohibits recruiting of children under 15 under the armed forces. The prohibits bombing nuclear power stations and weapons which cause long-term and severe environmental damage, and the use of weapons that cause superficial injury or unnecessary suffering, which basically, again, we don't want to cause suffering to civilians, right? You are at war with the army. You are not at war with civilians. Now, if they rise up against you, maybe there's a resistance. That's one thing. But again, that should be only towards the resistance fighters, not all civilians. Protocol 2, you want to write down this, right? Adds explicit protections to civilians during civil war, prohibits collective punishment, which means like you can't punish a village because one person is causing damage or killing the army, right? So you can't like shoot, oh, well, I'm going to shoot 10 civilians if that person doesn't come forward or whatnot, right? That's prohibited. Pillage, terrorism, and hostage-taking attacks on basic needs for civilians. Survival, such as crops, drinking water supplies, and irrigation systems. You got to allow these people to live their lives even under your authority. And then you have the Uniform Code of Military Justice. You want to write down this, and then there's this YouTube video about it. U.S. Armed Services Law and Regulations. Military personnel who mistreat prisoners can be prosecuted by court-martial under various provisions of the UCMJ. Military contractors working for the Department of Defense might also be prosecuted under Military Extraterritorial Jurisdiction Act of 2000. So again, this is not just for military personnel, but also military contractors if you're working for the Department of Defense. So it does apply, although it's harder to convict. They are supposedly under the Uniform Code of Military Justice. So we will talk more about this and go into more detail at a later time. Hey, thanks for listening.